Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive. Today we're going beyond those typical headlines about the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, we're going to be tackling some stuff you might not hear on the regular news channels.
Exactly. We're digging into a perspective from inside Ukraine, one that challenges some of those common narratives, those narratives we hear so often here in the West.
It's really easy to kind of accept a simple story, right? Especially with something as complex as this war.
Definitely.
But to really understand it, we got to hear voices like Marta Hrisko's.
Right, and she's not just anyone. Like, she's a historian from Ukraine who specializes in Holocaust and genocide studies.
Wow.
And she teaches at Clark University. We're going to be looking at this interview she did on the Useful Idiots YouTube channel. You know that one with Katie Halper and Aaron Mate.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
What really hit me is that Havershko isn't some far-off observer. She's got family and friends right there in the middle of everything.
So it's personal for her.
Yeah, totally.
And that gives her a perspective that's both deeply personal, but also like informed by all her historical knowledge.
Exactly. Okay, so ready for this. Havershko actually voted for Zelensky back in 2019.
Really?
Yeah.
That's surprising considering how disillusioned she seems with him
I
now.
know, it's wild, right? It's not just buyer's remorse either. Like, at the time, she had these hopes about his promises, tackling corruption, finding a way to end that Donbass war. It started back in 2014, remember?
Right.
But her take now, Zelensky's so focused on keeping the West happy
Yeah.
that it's costing everyday Ukrainians.
That's interesting. What's fascinating, too, is that she's not alone in feeling this way. She mentions a poll in the interview
Oh, yeah.
showing Zelensky's approval rating is like super low, like 16%.
Seriously, 16%. That's got to raise some big questions about his political future, right? Especially with all this talk about possible peace talks and stuff.
For sure. And, his actions before the invasion are also getting a lot of attention. I mean, it's important to remember that the Ukrainian government knew it was coming.
Yeah.
But as Havrishko points out, they didn't do enough to evacuate people from those really vulnerable areas, places like Mariupol and Bucha.
Oh man, can you imagine being a parent, in one of those cities,
Yeah,
knowing an attack is about to happen,
it's coming. And
and you can't get your family to safety? That's terrifying.
totally. It really highlights that sense of betrayal that many Ukrainians are feeling, this lack of preparation, especially on top of all that corruption Havrishko describes. It's really shaken people's trust.
Makes you wonder who's actually paying the price in this war. Because, like Hafrishko says, it's the working class, the everyday people who are stuck.
Yeah.
They can't just bribe their way out of military service or flee the country, not like some of those wealthy elites have.
It's a stark example of how this conflict is making the gap between the rich and the poor even wider.
Totally. Havrishko even shares these stories about her own family, people serving on the front lines.
Wow.
They're struggling with suicidal thoughts. It's a scary reminder of the mental toll of war, not just on the soldiers, but their families, too.
Definitely. And it makes you think about how these real stories clash with that romanticized image we see a lot in Western media of the Ukrainian resistance.
Exactly. It's like they're trying to paint a picture that,
Isn't quite the whole story.
right, and that's something Havrishko takes issue with big time. She's super critical of this article in the Washington Post.
Oh, yeah.
It focuses on, like, this recruitment campaign for the Azov battalion.
Hmm.
To her, it's a perfect example of how the West kind of glosses over the harsh reality of war and ignores important perspectives.
And she points out something specific about the article. It uses this image of a woman posing in lingerie for the military campaign, and Havrishko saying this is ignoring the voices of women, especially those who are against the Azov battalion.
Yeah, like they're trying to control the narrative.
Definitely raises questions about whose stories we're hearing and whose are getting left out. And this brings us to a really crucial point Havrishko makes, the danger of one dominant narrative shaping how we see the whole war.
Right. And she's especially frustrated with Western media for often missing a big part of the picture,
Which is,
the influence of these far-right groups like the Azov battalion.
right,
And it's not just some abstract thing for her. She's getting death threats from Azov supporters and other far-right groups because she's speaking out against them. Wow.
it's pretty intense.
To think that just saying what you think could put your life in danger?
Yeah, and what's even crazier is that she's facing pressure to stay quiet, not just from the extremists, but from her own colleagues, academics. It's like, don't rock the boat, but the boat's sinking.
Right. But why would these academics, these people who are supposed to be all about open discussion and stuff,
Yeah.
why would they try to silence her?
Well, Hrisko says a lot of her colleagues are worried. They think her criticisms are going to, like, make Ukraine look bad
Hmm.
and jeopardize the support they're getting from the West. They're scared of the consequences, even if they agree with her.
Like, what's this loyalty test? But the stakes are crazy high.
Yeah, exactly. And she tweeted this really powerful thing about it. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, yeah, she wrote, "I hope that all my colleagues who claim that I am obsessed with the far right in Ukraine will take care of the higher education of my child if I get killed by those Nazis who have no influence in Ukraine. Oksana Shobal, can you give me this promise publicly? Others. Anyone."
Whoa, that's intense. It's like she's laying it all out there, the fear, the risks,
Yeah,
just for telling the truth. And being called obsessed with the far right, that's messed up.
it is. It's like they're trying to make her concerns seem, I don't know, like she's overreacting or something. But look, her fears are real. I mean, the death threats, the murder of Professor Oksana Shebel she talks about.
Yeah, it's scary.
It reminds us that these aren't just like theoretical debates.
Right.
There are real consequences.
Yeah, okay, but let's go back to the Azov battalion for a sec. In the interview, they play this clip of Zelensky being asked about them on Fox News.
Oh, wow.
Apparently, it's one of the few times he's talked about it publicly.
Hmm.
And what's interesting is he didn't actually deny that they're neo-Nazi beginnings,
Right.
but he does try to downplay them.
So what does he say?
Well, he says they've been integrated into the Ukrainian military, like they're not a separate group anymore, and that anyone who committed crimes has been prosecuted. Basically, he's saying, don't worry, it's handled.
Trying to reassure everyone.
Exactly. But Hrisko, she's not buying it.
Right. So what's her take?
She's like, nope, the Azov Battalion, even with its new name, the 3rd Assault Brigade, it's still a breeding ground for extremist ideology.
I see.
And she points to the fact that a lot of the members still openly wear Nazi symbols and even celebrate Hitler's birthday, which is illegal in Ukraine, by the way.
It is. Wow. So it seems like Zelensky's kind of stuck, right? He needs support from the West to fight this war,
Yeah.
but he's also got to keep control of all these different groups within Ukraine, even the ones with extreme views.
It's a tough spot to be in.
For sure.
Makes you wonder, how much do we really know about the groups we're supporting in Ukraine? I mean, it's pretty wild that the Azov Battalion was actually made part of the Ukrainian military back in 2014.
Before the invasion even happened.
Way before. So, like, Western countries have been kind of supporting a group with neo-Nazi roots for years.
Indirectly, yeah. And that makes the whole shift in media coverage even more, like, suspicious.
Right, like Hrisko talks about these 2 headlines from The Guardian, one from 2018, one from 2025. Both are about the Azov Battalion's recruitment, but the 2018 headline calls them a neo-Nazi group. And the 2025 one, they just describe them as a high-profile combat unit. No mention of their ideology at all.
So they're cleaning up the image.
Exactly. Like, erasing the truth to fit a certain narrative makes you wonder what other information is being twisted or hidden, right?
It's unsettling.
It is. This whole thing with the Azov Battalion and how they're being portrayed, it throws up a lot of red flags for me. Like, how much can we actually trust what we're hearing about this war?
It's a good reminder to be skeptical, to look for information from different places, especially when it comes to stuff like war that's so complicated and emotional.
Yeah, for sure. And the whole thing about how historical narratives are used to justify violence, that's fascinating too.
No, totally. Hrisko argues that the Ukrainian government's kind of picking and choosing what they remember about history. Specifically, they tend to glorify certain nationalist figures, those who worked with the Nazis during World War II. And she says that's actually played a role in the rise of the far right.
So it's like they're cherry-picking the past to fit what they need now.
Exactly. She's saying that this manipulation of history is being used to make Russia look like the bad guy and justify the war.
Even if it means ignoring the bad things done by, by the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
So it's not just about remembering what happened, it's about shaping a story that serves a purpose right now. But that seems, I don't know, dangerous.
It is dangerous because it makes history too simple. It fuels hate, it fuels division, it creates this us versus them mentality. And when you think like that, it's way harder to find common ground and work towards peace.
Right, because it ignores how complex history really is. Nobody's completely innocent.
Exactly. It's a good reminder to always be critical of how history is presented, especially when it's being used to justify violence or demonize a whole group of people.
Man, this is heavy stuff. But what strikes me is that Hrisko is willing to put herself out there, even with the risks, to her career, even to her safety.
It takes a lot of courage to do that.
It does, and her willingness to speak truth to power, even when it's unpopular, it's dangerous. I don't know, it's inspiring. It reminds us that we all have a responsibility to challenge injustice and speak out against oppression, no matter where it's happening. I'm also thinking about how this pressure to conform, It's not just in war zones or political debates. It happens to us in everyday life too, right?
Oh, yeah,
Like
absolutely.
on a smaller scale. When we're scared to say what we really think at work or with our friends because we don't want to be judged or left out.
That's a really good point. It's easy to feel like you got to go along with everyone else, even if you disagree. But Havertzko's story, it reminds us that staying silent can be just as bad, as going along with something wrong. Speaking up, even when it's hard, that's how we create a more just world.
Right. Okay, before we wrap up part two, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. It's something Havrishka said about the impact of this war on like the mental health of everyday Ukrainians.
Yeah, that doesn't get talked about enough. She mentioned her relatives struggling with suicidal thoughts. But it's not just the soldiers on the front lines.
Right.
The whole country is dealing with this massive trauma.
It's heartbreaking to think about all those invisible wounds, the constant fear, the loss, not knowing what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
It all takes a toll. Makes you wonder about the long-term impact on Ukrainian society.
Oh, for sure. We're talking about a whole generation that's been scarred by this conflict. The psychological effects of war, they can last for years, even decades.
It's crazy.
It's essential that we remember that. They need support, mental health support, now and in the future.
You're right. It's easy to focus on the physical damage, the politics, all that.
Yeah.
But we can't forget about the human cost, the impact it has on millions of people's lives. As we've been talking about all this, it's got me thinking about how easy it is to get caught up in the big picture, the geopolitics, the strategies, the battles.
Right, the headlines.
Yeah. But Havrishka's story brings it back down to earth, like reminds you about the people.
It's powerful. Behind all those headlines, there are actual people whose lives are being torn apart. And it's not just the physical danger, right?
No.
It's the emotional and psychological toll on individuals, families, whole communities. It's huge.
It is. And what really stuck with me is what she said about how the war has made those inequalities in Ukraine even worse. Like, it's the working class, the people who can't just pick up and leave,
Yeah.
they're the ones stuck dealing with the worst of it.
And it's such a contrast with the wealthy elite, right? A lot of them have just left the country. While everyone else, the people who can't afford to go, they're facing conscription, they're displaced, they're struggling financially. Haversto's stories about her own family trying to just get by, it really brings that home.
It makes you question that whole narrative we hear about, a unified Ukraine standing strong.
Right.
Because it's clear the burden of this war, it's not being shared equally.
No, it's not. And it goes back to what we were saying before about how important it is to hear from different perspectives, especially the people who are often silenced or marginalized. Their voices, their stories, that's where we can start to understand how complicated this conflict really is.
Yeah. And I'm also struck by how, I don't know, how much of what Havrishka talks about, it's happening everywhere, not just Ukraine.
Hmm?
The way narratives are controlled, how dissent is shut down, powerful people manipulating information. It's like this fight for truth and justice, it's not limited to one place.
It's a global thing, and it means we have to be, on guard, question the information we're given, hold those in power accountable.
Where do we go from here? Like, what can we do as individuals to make sure we're engaging with this conflict and really any complex issue in a responsible way, a way that's actually informed?
Well, I think it starts with acknowledging that there's rarely just one truth. We got to be open to different perspectives, even the ones that make us uncomfortable or challenge what we think.
And for me, that means looking for information from all sorts of sources, not just sticking to, what pops up in our social media feeds or the usual news channels.
For sure, like diversifying what we're reading, what we're listening to, and being critical too. Who's the source? What are their biases? Is there evidence to back up what they're saying?
Because it's so easy to just believe what we want to believe, especially when it's something emotional like war. But that's when we need to be even more careful. Step back, really look at the information.
Exactly. And supporting independent media, journalists who are trying to report the truth, even when it's, not popular, they're the ones holding the powerful accountable, giving a voice to the people who don't have one.
Yeah, they're doing the hard work, and we can support them and also support the organizations that are helping people affected by the war, especially the ones who are most vulnerable.
Absolutely. Because in the end, this war is about people, real lives. And anything we can do to help to reduce suffering, it matters.
It does. This deep dive has been, well, intense. Whenever Shko's perspective has really made me think about how I consume information and how dangerous it is when just one narrative takes over.
And for me, it's highlighted the importance of, having the courage to speak up, to challenge those in power, and also to challenge our own beliefs, even when it's hard.
It's a lot to process, but one thing's clear. To really understand what's happening in Ukraine, we got to look beyond the simple stories, the easy answers. We have to grapple with those uncomfortable truths, the stuff that's often hidden.
Yeah. And remember, the search for peace and justice, it starts with truth. It starts with being willing to listen to each other, to different viewpoints, and having empathy for everyone who's affected by conflict.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.